I have been a pediatric ER doctor for nearly 20 years, and in that time, I have witnessed more ways for a child's body to fail than I ever thought possible. I have seen tiny lungs drown in their own fluid. I have felt the fragile pulse of a heart so small it seemed to flutter like the wing of a bird beneath my fingertips. I have walked into rooms where parents screamed at the ceiling as though some higher power might be shaken awake and forced to undo what had just been taken from them. And I have walked out of those same rooms carrying a weight that no amount of training, no degree, and no white coat can protect you from. That is the life of a pediatric ER physician, to stand at the intersection of science and suffering, to fight back chaos with protocols and monitors and drugs that sometimes work, and sometimes don't. But even after all those years, there was one night, one case, that still hangs in my memory like smoke that refuses to clear. It was not the most violent trauma I had ever seen. It was not the most medically confounding diagnosis I had ever chased. It was something far stranger. Something that gnawed at the very foundations of what it means to care for a patient, to document, to bear witness. It was a case that ended not with death, but with disappearance. And the truth is, I can't explain it. Not to my colleagues, not to the hospital administration, not even to myself. The child was there, and then the child was gone. The night began like so many others, with chaos spilling through the double doors of the emergency room in waves. The smell hit me first, as it always did. Bleach mixed with sweat, iodine clinging to my gloves. The faint chemical sweetness of cleaning solutions that never quite erased the underlying scent of blood, vomit, and fear. The ER is a symphony of sounds if you've worked in it long enough. The harsh beeping of monitors that refuse to sync into harmony. The mechanical sigh of a ventilator pushing air into failing lungs. The static crackle of paramedics' radios clipped to their belts as they hand off their patients. And threaded through it all, human voices sharp with urgency, heavy with panic, or brittle with grief. That night, I was halfway through my shift. My scrubs were already stained, not in the dramatic way television shows portray, with arterial spray or cinematic splashes of red, but with the dull, mottled patterns of a long night, dried betadine, streaks of saline, the faint shadow of a blood smear rubbed in and mostly washed away. My hands ached from hours of compression, stitching, writing, holding, steadying. My pager buzzed constantly, like some mechanical insect refusing to die. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, too bright to ever feel natural, and too dim to ever truly chase away the shadows that lingered in the corners of the ER. I remember thinking, as I often did, how strange it was that time inside the hospital didn't flow the way it did outside. There were no sunsets or sunrises here, only the endless hum of machinery and the turning of cases. Hours stacked on hours, and you could not tell if the night was advancing or if it was standing still. That was when the call came from triage. A child was being brought in. No trauma alert, no code. Just a child who had been found unresponsive under circumstances that were unclear. The nurse's voice was calm, but I heard something else threaded through it. Something you learn to recognize when you've worked together long enough. Unease. I turned toward the glass doors just as the paramedics rolled in the stretcher. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Small, pale, his limbs tucked under the thin blanket as though he were simply sleeping. His dark hair was matted with sweat, his lips tinged with a bluish hue that spoke of oxygen deprivation. The monitor they had hooked him up to showed vital signs that looked deceptively stable. Heart rate just under 100. Oxygen saturation in the low 90s. Blood pressure that you might expect from a child his age. Nothing dramatic, nothing catastrophic. But something in his stillness chilled me. The paramedic rattled off his report with the clipped efficiency of someone trying to sound more confident than they felt. Found unresponsive at home, Parents called 911. No trauma noted, no signs of seizure activity. Pupils equal and reactive. We started O2, IV in the left AC, gave a fluid bolus en route. He roused briefly, then drifted back. GCS 11 on arrival. He shrugged almost imperceptibly at the end, the way paramedics do when they can't wrap a story into a neat conclusion. I leaned over the child. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, more to test his response than out of comfort. His eyelids fluttered, but he did not open them. I checked his pupils myself, pressed gently at his nail beds, noted the faint withdrawal. Neurological, then. But what kind? Behind me, the boy's parents stumbled in, their faces etched with panic. The mother clutched her sweater closed with one hand, the other hovering in the air as though she could reach her child if only the nurses weren't in the way. The father kept running his hand through his hair, over and over, his eyes darting to me as if I might already have an answer ready. "What happened?" I asked them gently, my voice carrying the weight of both professionalism and sympathy. The mother shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "We don't know. He was fine. He was playing in his room. Then he didn't answer when I called him for dinner. I found him on the floor. He was breathing, but he wouldn't wake up." I nodded, making mental notes even as I signaled for labs, for a CT, for the respiratory therapist to set up. The ER is triage, always. Rule out the things that kill quickly, stabilize what you can, work backward toward the elusive answer. But even as we began, I felt it. The strangeness of the case, wrapping itself around the edges of my mind. As we worked, I studied the boy more closely. His skin was pale, but not in the waxy way of shock. His breathing was shallow but regular. His heart tones were steady under my stethoscope. Nothing screamed emergency. And yet, nothing felt right. The nurses moved with their practiced rhythm. IV fluids hung, blood samples drawn, a warm blanket tucked around the boy's slight frame. His parents hovered, the mother whispering his name over and over, as though repetition might summon him back. I wanted to reassure them. I wanted to tell them this was something we could fix, but I couldn't. Not yet. Because here's the truth about medicine, about the ER, about all the training and textbooks and simulations. They teach you how to respond when a heart stops, when a lung collapses, when blood pours from an open wound. They give you algorithms for crises, for the dramatic moments when everything hinges on seconds. But they don't prepare you for the quiet mysteries, the cases that slip through your fingers, not because you weren't fast enough, but because nothing fits. And this boy did not fit. I remember standing at the foot of the bed, watching the monitor's steady green line march across the screen, and feeling a ripple of unease run through me. It wasn't the numbers. It wasn't the child's stillness. It was something deeper, something that whispered that we were standing at the edge of a case that would not end the way we expected. At the time, I shook it off. There was work to do. There always was. But looking back now, I realized that was the first moment, the first signal that this case would stay with me long after the chart was closed and the room was cleaned. Because children don't just vanish. And yet, before the night was over, that is exactly what would happen. The first shock came only 20 minutes after the boy arrived. We had drawn blood, sent it to the lab, ordered a head CT, and monitored him while we waited. I expected something, low sodium, blood sugar crash, maybe a silent seizure disorder that had finally shown its hand. But when the labs came back, every single value was normal, perfectly normal. Sodium, potassium, glucose, lactate. Every number lined up as if this child had been plucked straight out of a textbook example. That should have been a relief. It wasn't. Because children don't collapse without cause, and children don't lie unresponsive while their bodies, hum along in perfect harmony. Something was off, and the clean labs only made the silence around him louder. I remember glancing at the nurse who had just handed me the printout. She was seasoned, calm, the kind who could insert a line blindfolded and keep her composure while parents screamed. But as I scanned the paper, I caught her eyes flicking nervously toward the boy. She didn't say a word, but I could read it in her face. This doesn't make sense. We wheeled him down for the CT scan. The parents followed, the mother clutching the father's arm so tightly that the knuckles of her hand went white. The technician strapped the boy in, his small frame swallowed by the machine, and we watched as the scanner hummed around his head. Minutes stretched. The images appeared on the screen. And again, nothing. No bleed, no swelling, no tumor pressing silently against brain tissue. His brain looked as pristine as if it had been drawn for an anatomy class. I felt the unease creep higher into my chest. We brought him back to the ER, reattached the monitors, watched the steady, deceptive rhythm of his vitals. The parents whispered to each other in fragments, the kind of conversation you can only hear when the world has tilted on its axis. The father finally turned to me. "Doctor," he said, his voice low and urgent, "is he going to wake up?" I could have given him an answer wrapped in statistics, probabilities, medical jargon. Instead, I told him the truth. "I don't know." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than they should have been. And then it happened. The boy's eyes snapped open, no slow flutter, no gradual return of consciousness. 1 second he was motionless. The next his eyes were wide, staring at the ceiling with a strange clarity that made every muscle in my body lock tight. The monitor showed no change. Heart steady, oxygen steady. But his body, the still unresponsive body, was suddenly awake. "Hey, buddy," I said quickly, stepping closer. "Can you hear me? Can you tell me your name?" His gaze shifted, not toward me, not toward his parents, but toward the far corner of the room. His lips parted, and he whispered something so faint that for a moment I thought I had imagined it. "What was that?" I asked, leaning in, desperate to catch it. The mother was crying now, clutching the side of the bed. "Sweetheart, it's Mommy. Look at me." But he didn't. His eyes remained fixed on the corner, and this time I heard it. Words, unmistakable, though broken and soft. "She's here." Every hair on the back of my neck stood on end. "Who's here?" I pressed. "What do you mean? Who's here?" But before anyone else could speak, before the parents could plead or the nurse could jot a note, his eyes rolled back. The lids fell shut, and just like that, he was gone again. Vitals unchanged, body unchanged, slipping back into that unnatural sleep as though nothing had ever happened. The room was silent. No one moved for several seconds. It was the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of questions, of fear, of the sense that we had all just crossed into something we didn't understand. The father broke it first. What did he mean? Who was he talking to? I wanted to dismiss it as delirium, a misfire of neurons, a meaningless fragment of dream bleeding into consciousness. But the precision of his words, the clarity in that moment, burned against every rational explanation I could reach for. We doubled down after that. Neurology consult, EEG to look for seizure activity, toxicology screen expanded to catch anything exotic. Every result came back blank. Every line of data mocked us with its ordinariness. And yet, twice more that night, he woke the same way. Snapping open his eyes, staring toward the same corner, whispering to someone none of us could see. The second time he said only one word, "Don't." The third he began to cry, not loud, not writhing, just tears sliding down his face as he whispered, "I have to go." By then, even the nurses avoided standing near that corner. One muttered under her breath about a draft. about how the temperature seemed to dip when you walked past. Another refused to look at the boy when he stirred, pretending to busy herself with paperwork instead. These were professionals, hardened by years in the ER, and yet unease had crawled its way into every corner of the room. I told myself over and over that there was a rational explanation. Children hallucinate under stress. Hypoxia can create strange perceptions. The brain is fragile, and fragility breeds illusions. But deep down, I knew this was different. And then, at 3:14 a.m., just as the monitors blinked another set of steady numbers across the screen, the most shocking moment of all arrived. The boy vanished. One moment, he was there, breathing shallowly, wrapped in a hospital blanket, electrodes taped to his skin. The next, the bed was empty. The first sound after the boy vanished wasn't a scream. It was the alarm of the heart monitor, shrieking into the room as though the machine itself couldn't accept what had just happened. Flatline, not the sound of a dying heart, but the electronic protest of empty leads. The nurse at the bedside gasped, her tray of supplies clattering to the floor. The mother's cry tore through the air, raw and jagged, as she lunged toward the bed. But there was nothing to hold. Her son was gone. The blanket still lay in place, indented as though his body should have been there. Electrodes dangled, adhesive edges curling in the air where they had been stuck moments before. The IV tubing hung limp, fluid dripping onto the sheet, the catheter end uncapped and bare. He had not risen, had not climbed out, had not walked past us. He had simply ceased to be in that bed. For one frozen second, no one moved. Then the room erupted. "Lockdown!" I snapped, louder than I'd ever shouted inside the ER before. My voice cut across the chaos, sharpened by instinct. "Call security now!" The charge nurse bolted for the phone. The father turned in circles, his hands clawing at his hair. "Where is he? Where is my son?" His voice broke on the word son, cracking into a sound that made my stomach lurch. The mother dropped to her knees by the empty bed, clutching the blanket, as if the fabric itself still carried some trace of him. She pressed it to her face, sobbing, whispering his name in a disbelief. I tore through the room, as though sheer determination could undo what had just occurred. I checked under the bed, behind the curtain, yanked open the supply cabinets, as if he might be impossibly hiding there. The irrationality of my actions didn't matter. I couldn't stop. Security stormed in minutes later, followed by administrators. Radios crackled. Doors slammed. They combed the ER, then the hallways, then every ward. Elevators were halted. Stairwells blocked. Staff questioned. But there was no trace of him. No one had seen a boy leave. No cameras captured movement. It was as though the hospital itself had swallowed him whole. The parents were taken to a quiet room, though quiet was a cruel misnomer for the storm that raged within those walls. Their cries echoed down the hallway, muffled but unrelenting. I wanted to go to them, to offer something, explanation, comfort, anything. But I had nothing. Nothing but questions that burned at the back of my throat and threatened to suffocate me. The administrators pressed me hard. "Doctor, when was the last confirmed time you saw the patient physically present in the bed?" "Less than 30 seconds before," I said, my voice flat, numb. "And you're certain no one entered or exited the room?" "I was standing right there," I replied. "We all were. We all saw." The nurse beside me nodded mutely, her hands still trembling. Another staff member leaned against the wall, pale as if she might collapse. None of us had answers. Hours passed in a blur of futile searches and whispered theories. Hospital leadership called law enforcement. Detectives arrived, grim-faced, moving through the hospital with notebooks and questions sharp as scalpels. They asked if I was sure he hadn't gotten up and walked out. I wanted to scream. A child doesn't rip out his IV, shed his electrodes, and vanish past half a dozen staff without being seen. And yet, what alternative could I give them? That he had dissolved into thin air? That he had slipped into some unseen fold of reality, called away by the corner he stared at with such unwavering fear? Those weren't answers. Those were madness. I replayed every moment in my mind. The first time his eyes opened, the words he whispered, "She's here." The warning, "Don't." The resignation, "I have to go." The pieces assembled into a picture that chilled me to the core, but it was not one I could present in any medical chart, any incident report, any courtroom testimony. The parents stayed until dawn, their grief hollowing them out into shadows of themselves. The hospital tried to comfort them, tried to promise that every measure was being taken. But promises are paper thin when a child disappears from under your care. Their eyes found mine more than once, full of a raw accusation that needed no words. You were supposed to protect him. When the sun finally broke across the horizon, painting the hospital windows with pale light, the case was already spiraling into rumor. Staff whispered in corners. Families in the waiting room murmured about abduction, about failures in security, about lawsuits. And beneath all of it, I carried the weight of a truth. I couldn't speak. None of their explanations fit. Because children don't vanish. Not like this. That morning, after the parents had been escorted away by detectives, after the administrators had retreated into conference rooms to strategize damage control, I found myself back in the room where it had happened. The bed was stripped bare, the monitors powered down. The floor gleamed, freshly mopped, smelling faintly of bleach. It looked ordinary, utterly, painfully ordinary. But when I stood at the foot of the bed, I felt it, the same ripple of unease I had felt when the boy first arrived. The same inexplicable weight pressing at the edges of my perception. I turned slowly, my gaze falling on the corner he had stared at 3 times before. Nothing was there. No shadow, no figure, just a blank wall. And yet my skin prickled, my breath caught, and I had the unbearable sense that if I stayed long enough, I would hear him whisper again, "She's here." In the days that followed, the hospital became a place I no longer recognized. Detectives swarmed the hallways, their questions slicing into staff like scalpels. Every chart, every log, every timestamp from that night was pored over, dissected, doubted. Administrators huddled in meetings, behind closed doors, their faces drawn, their language shifting from clinical precision to legal strategy. Security footage was reviewed frame by frame, slowed down until the grainy figures of nurses and patients blurred into ghosts. And always, the same conclusion. The boy had entered, but never left. The press caught wind by the second day. They camped outside the hospital entrance with cameras raised, their questions shouted like accusations. Where's the missing boy? Was he abducted inside the ER? What failures allowed this to happen? Each time I walked past, my stomach tightened into a fist. Inside, the staff fractured under the weight of rumor. Some clung to rational explanations: abduction, error in record-keeping, a smuggled exit through some overlooked corridor. Others whispered things they wouldn't dare put in writing, that the child had never been alive when he arrived, that what we had treated was a shadow, an echo, something that belonged elsewhere. One nurse swore she had felt her sleeve tugged in the hallway, just outside his room, though no one had been near. Another claimed she had heard a child crying in an empty bay during the early hours of the morning. These were not the kind of people prone to superstition. These were professionals who had spent decades staring down death and chaos. But fear has a way of seeping through cracks when explanations collapse. I tried to anchor myself in medicine, in science, in the concrete rituals of my profession. I reread his labs a dozen times, scoured the imaging for anomalies, replayed the EEG recordings until the waveforms danced behind my eyelids when I closed my eyes. There was nothing, no sign of pathology, no hidden illness, no irregular spike that could explain what happened. And yet, the words he whispered refused to leave me. "She's here. Don't. I have to go." I wrote them down in the margin of my notes as though capturing them on paper might dull their sting, but instead they grew heavier, circling my thoughts with each passing day. Who was she? Why the warning? Why the resignation? Those weren't the words of a child in delirium. They were too deliberate, too knowing. Sleep became impossible. When I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those sudden, wide-open eyes staring into the corner, those tears slipping silently down his cheeks. I heard his mother's scream echoing through the ER, his father's broken voice demanding answers I could never give. On the third night, I returned to the hospital after my shift ended, unable to stay away. The halls were quieter in the early morning hours, the fluorescent lights casting long, sterile shadows. I walked back to the room. It was unassigned now, stripped bare, its emptiness like an open wound. I stood at the foot of the bed again, just as I had that night. My chest tightened. The hum of the lights seemed louder here, the air colder. I tried to steady myself with logic. There was nothing in the corner, just drywall, paint, sterile space. And yet my body told me otherwise. My skin prickled, my heart raced, my breath came shallow. I whispered into the silence before I could stop myself. "Who are you?" The question hung there, absurd and desperate. The room gave no reply, only the steady hum of the lights and the faint squeak of a cart rolling down the hall outside. But as I turned to leave, I thought I heard it. So faint, so soft, I almost dismissed it. A child's laugh. I froze, my throat closed. I listened, every muscle rigid. Nothing followed, just silence again. But the sound lingered in my mind, replaying until I doubted whether I had heard it at all. The next morning, administration called me into a meeting. The atmosphere was suffocating. Lawyers sat at the table beside hospital leaders, their voices measured, their questions sharp. They asked me to recount every detail of the night. Again, every observation, every word. I gave them what I could. The vitals, the labs, the tests, the timeline. When I hesitated, when I came to the whispers, I faltered. "Doctor," one of the lawyers pressed. "You noted the patient spoke briefly. What exactly did he say?" I swallowed hard. My mind screamed to sanitize it, to translate it into something palatable, but my voice betrayed me. He said, "She's here." He said, "Don't." And then, he said, "I have to go." The room went still. The lawyer's pen hovered over his pad. An administrator exchanged a glance with another, subtle but heavy with meaning. Finally, one of them spoke, careful and deliberate. "We will not include those statements in the official report." My stomach twisted, but he said them. "Doctor," the administrator said, his tone clipped, "we are dealing with a disappearance that already defies explanation. We cannot introduce words that will only fuel speculation and hysteria. Do you understand?" I nodded, but inside I felt something fracture. To erase those words was to erase the truth of what I had witnessed. And yet, I said nothing. I walked out of that meeting feeling like I had betrayed the boy, like I had abandoned him a second time. In the weeks that followed, the case consumed me. Detectives visited my home more than once, hoping to catch some detail I hadn't remembered before. Journalists left messages on my voicemail, promising anonymity if I would speak off the record. Families who had heard the rumors sent letters to the hospital demanding to know how their own children could ever be safe. Through it all, I kept returning in my mind to that one corner of the room, blank, silent, ordinary, and yet forever altered by the direction of a child's gaze, medicine teaches you to believe in cause and effect, symptom and diagnosis, action and result. But this case carved a hollow in that belief, left me staring into a void where answers should have been. And in that void, my own reflection stared back, haunted, questioning, diminished. Because children don't just vanish, not from locked rooms, not from beds surrounded by doctors and nurses, not from beneath the unblinking eyes of monitors. And yet, one did, under my watch. Months passed, but the boy never returned. No trace was ever found. No child matching his description appeared in the databases. No unidentified body turned up. No tip or sighting ever reached the detective's ears. It was as though he had been erased not only from the hospital, but from the world itself. And yet, for me, he never left. Every night I stepped back into the emergency room. I carried him with me. I saw his eyes open when I checked pupils. I heard his whispers when I leaned close to another child. I felt the absence in every empty bed, a reminder that the hospital is not as airtight as we want to believe, that sometimes the walls themselves let go of what we try to contain. I tried in the weeks afterward to build explanations. I tried to wedge the case back into the framework of medicine and reason, as though fitting it into a box might finally let me sleep. The first theory was the simplest: abduction. Perhaps someone slipped past us, timed their entrance and exit to perfection, plucked the boy from his bed in the seconds when our eyes were elsewhere. But to accept that was to believe in impossibility. There had been 6 of us in that room. The monitors screamed the moment his electrodes lost contact. Security had sealed the exits within minutes. Cameras caught no one. Even the detectives admitted quietly, in unguarded moments, that the logistics didn't add up. The second theory was psychological, a kind of collective delirium, an episode of mass misperception. Perhaps stress had played tricks on us all. Perhaps we remembered wrong, filled in blanks, convinced ourselves of something that hadn't really happened. But I cannot accept that. I remember the feel of his pulse, the sound of his voice, the wetness of his tears as I brushed them from his cheek. Those details do not dissolve into illusion. The third theory was medical, that he had been in a state of consciousness so fractured, so rare, that his behavior, his words, his disappearance could be explained by some unstudied corner of neurology. That he walked out while our eyes were fixed on the monitor, leaving behind the wires, the tubing, the blanket, somehow moving faster, quieter, more completely than any child could. But if that were true, then where did he go? Why did no camera see him? No witness stop him? No trail remain? And then there was the fourth theory, the one I never spoke aloud in meetings or reports, the one that crept in during the loneliest hours of the night. That the boy's words were not delirium, not hallucination, but truth. That someone or something had come for him. That his whispers were warnings, not nonsense. That when he said, "I have to go," he meant it not as resignation, but as inevitability. I do not know if I believe in spirits. I do not know if I believe in forces beyond the reach of science. But I know what I saw. I know the terror in his eyes. I know the way he fixed his gaze on that empty corner, unwavering, as though someone stood there invisible to us all. And I know that children don't just vanish. The hospital moved on eventually. They always do. Staff transferred. Administrators retired. New policies were written to cover the cracks this case had exposed. The parents disappeared from public view, swallowed by a grief too deep to share with cameras or reporters. The detectives moved to new files, fresher cases that could yield results. But I never moved on. I still walk those halls, the rhythm of the ER unchanged, Stretchers rolling in, monitors blaring, voices rising in desperate pleas. I still fight for every child who passes through my care, still throw myself into the chaos with the same devotion I always have. But there is a shadow behind it all now, a question I cannot silence. What if medicine is not enough? What if all our monitors and scans and protocols are powerless against forces we cannot measure? What if the ER, for all its fluorescent light and antiseptic smell, is not a fortress against the unknown, but a threshold where worlds brush too close together? Sometimes, when I pass the room where it happened, I stop. I tell myself I'm just checking supplies, just taking a moment to breathe. But really, I am listening. And sometimes, I cannot tell if it is memory or imagination. I hear him again. A whisper in the quiet, faint but clear. She's here. It has been years, but I still cannot shake the feeling that someone came for that boy, and that nothing I could have done would have stopped it. I am an ER doctor. I am trained to save lives, to cling to logic, to wrestle chaos into order. But there is no chart for what happened that night, no textbook that can map its path. There is only memory, and memory has teeth. The case will always haunt me. The case will always remind me that even in the brightest light of medicine, there are shadows we cannot drive away.